Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we take stacks of high-level source material and distill them down into the core knowledge you need to be seriously well-informed without, having to slog through the dense academic writing yourself.
Today, we are undertaking a deep, focused exploration of a single foundational concept that profoundly redefines how we look at relationships, ethics, and biology. It's an idea that when you grasp it fully, it changes the very definition of the good deed.
That's absolutely right. Our source material today comes from a truly seminal text in evolutionary thought, specifically diving into the crucial chapter titled Genesmanship from the Selfish Gene. Our mission is incredibly specific. We are here to break down the central paradox that underpins modern sociobiology. How can a gene, operating entirely under the principle of ruthless mechanical selfishness, compel the individual organism, the survival machine, to exhibit truly altruistic and self-sacrificial behavior toward others?
This deep dive is essentially about providing a genetics-based explanation for why an animal might choose to be nice, even at a personal cost. But, and this is the key, doing so from the most ruthlessly pragmatic biological perspective possible.
So to start, we have to set the stage. We need to define our central player, the selfish gene.
We do, and it is absolutely essential to understand that when we talk about a gene acting selfishly, we are not talking about a single physical piece of DNA sitting in one body.
Okay, so let's unpack this. If it's not just one physical strand, what is it?
It is rather a massive collection. It is all replicas of that particular bit of DNA distributed across potentially millions of individuals within the population, just as it was distributed across the ancient oceans, at the dawn of life.
So it's a distributed network.
It's a network, and if we allow ourselves to adopt the powerful and slightly anthropomorphic metaphor the chapter uses, the gene's singular simple goal is purely quantitative, to get more numerous in the gene pool across all subsequent generations.
And traditionally, it does this by programming its current body, its survival machine, to live long enough to reproduce successfully.
Right.
But the key concept here, the central question that genesmanship introduces, is the radical idea that this distributed agency, the gene, might be able to achieve success by assisting replicas of itself that are sitting not just in its own body, but in other bodies entirely.
Precisely. This is the moment where individual sacrifice is justified at the genetic level. If a gene carries a trait that programs its host body to take a lethal risk, say, to die in a self-sacrificial act.
Like jumping in a river to save someone.
Exactly. If that sacrifice saves a larger number of other bodies containing replicas of that exact same gene, then the gene has automatically succeeded in increasing its overall presence in the gene pool.
So one copy of the gene is lost, but 5 copies are saved. That's a massive win for the gene in the long run.
It's a net gain. This, genetically, is individual altruism brought about entirely by the pure, unadulterated selfishness of the gene. The individual organism suffers, but the gene thrives. The entire subsequent discussion relies on one single critical factor: how.
How can the gene achieve the recognition necessary to know which bodies contain its replicas?
That's the million-dollar question.
That recognition often is the critical hurdle. If the gene is distributed across a vast population, how does it accomplish this feat? It can't exactly send out a survey.
No.
The chapter starts us off with some truly theoretical, mind-bending thought experiments, even if they prove to be highly improbable in the real world, just to explore the conditions necessary for such a system to evolve.
This is where we examine the minimum biological requirements for a gene-level recognition system. We're sort of moving from the wildly improbable scenarios toward the system that evolution actually settled upon.
Let's start with the albino gene example in humans, which provides a vivid, if implausible, illustration of the recognition principle. We're discussing the specific recessive gene that causes albinism when present in a double dose. Statistically, it's quite rare in double dose, say 1 in 20,000 people, but it's carried by a significant percentage of the population in a single dose, meaning those people look perfectly normal.
And since this gene is distributed across many individuals, the albino gene could theoretically succeed in increasing its numbers if it programmed its host body, the survival machine, to behave altruistically only towards other albino bodies.
That's a genius thought experiment because an albino body is guaranteed to contain the gene in double dose. The gene doesn't have to guess.
There's no uncertainty.
So the albino gene residing in the altruistic body should be perfectly content if its host dies, provided that death helps other bodies containing the same gene to survive.
And we can put numbers on it. If the albino gene can compel one of its bodies to save the lives of 10 other albino bodies, the death of the altruist is more than compensated for.
Right. 2 copies of the gene are lost in the altruist, but 20 copies are saved in the beneficiaries. The gene wins.
The gene wins.
But help me translate this back into biological reality, because we don't see massive altruistic communes of albinos. Why shouldn't we expect albinos to be especially nice to each other?
The problem lies in the requirement for a simultaneous double effect from that single gene. Genes don't want anything, they're just chemical instructions. Success only happens automatically if the gene confers the right behavioral outcome.
So for this specific altruism to evolve,
For this to work, the albino gene must have 2 independent, co-occurring effects. It must confer its usual, externally visible developmental effect, albinism, the pale complexion, as a label, and it must simultaneously confer a tendency for selective altruism, specifically toward individuals bearing that very label.
so it's not enough to just make pale skin. It also has to program the complex neurological circuitry that says, when you see pale skin, risk your life.
Exactly. And that dual requirement is highly restrictive. This leads us directly to the classic and intentionally bizarre thought experiment known as the green beard altruism effect.
The ultimate label analogy.
Yeah.
The thought experiment proposes a gene that codes for 2 things. First, an externally visible, conspicuous label, the green beard. And second, a programmed behavioral tendency to be altruistic only to other individuals bearing a green beard. That gene, if it existed, would indeed be wildly successful. It could instantly recognize its replicas.
Theoretically possible, absolutely. The chapter emphasizes that genes often have multiple, seemingly unrelated effects. But the key phrase here is not particularly likely to evolve in nature.
Why is it so improbable that one single gene would pull off this trick, linking an arbitrary visual trait to a complex behavioral rule?
Because the characteristics a gene codes for tend to be somewhat arbitrary and disconnected in combination. Green beardedness is just as likely to be linked to developing ingrown toenails or maybe a preference for odd numbers. And a programmed fondness for green beards is just as likely to be linked to, say, an inability to process certain amino acids. Evolution, through the randomness of mutation and recombination, rarely delivers a package where one single gene perfectly codes for both the arbitrary visible label A and D, the specific complex behavioral preference for that label.
That's too much of a coincidence.
It's too large a coincidence to be a robust evolutionary solution.
So arbitrary labels are a long shot. If the gene can't rely on a green beard or pale skin, maybe it can be recognized by a less arbitrary label one that is derived from the gene's function itself.
You mean the altruistic act itself?
Yeah, the book suggests recognizing the gene by the altruistic act itself.
A fascinating possibility. A gene could prosper if it essentially said, body, if individual A is drowning as a result of trying to save someone else from drowning, jump in and rescue A. The fact that A is seen engaging in a potentially life-saving act is itself the label.
The equivalent of the green beard.
I see.
That act immediately suggests there is a greater than average chance that A contains the exact life-saving altruistic gene that the rescuer also possesses. It's a self-recognizing altruism loop.
It's definitely less arbitrary than a green beard, but the text still deems the scenario rather implausible as a primary mechanism. While it's better, it still relies on a highly complex chain of events and interpretations.
So what does evolution need?
Evolution needs a much more robust, statistically guaranteed method of identifying gene copies sitting in other bodies. We need a system that works not occasionally, but statistically across all populations where the gene is found.
A systematic shortcut, if you will.
Exactly, and that shortcut is the family tree.
Here's where we move from the hypothetical realm into the actual mechanism that drives altruism in the natural world. Kinship. Genes don't need green beards or complex moral judgment. They just need family ties.
This is the turning point of the argument, acknowledged in rough terms by figures like R.A. Fisher and J.B.S. Haldane decades earlier, but mathematically formalized and expanded significantly by W.D. Hamilton in his crucial 1964 papers.
So what did Hamilton do that was so different?
He demonstrated that the logic of gene success is not just reserved for the vertical line of descent parent to child, but applies equally to collateral relationships, siblings, nephews, nieces, and cousins.
Hamilton essentially said that if an individual dies to save 10 close relatives, it's the same genetic math as if that individual had saved 10 of its own offspring.
Exactly. One copy of the altruism gene is lost, but a larger number of copies is saved in the next generation.
And before we dive into the exact calculation, we have to address one crucial simplification the chapter makes when framing this. It's called the rarity assumption.
Right. Why do we assume we are talking about genes that are initially rare in the overall gene pool?
Well, if a gene is common, like the gene for having two working eyes, it's already obviously successful, and we don't need altruism to explain its spread.
Precisely. We are focused specifically on genes whose success is explained by their altruistic effect. Therefore, when they first mutate and begin to spread, these altruism genes must be rare.
And the key insight is,
The key insight is that even a gene that is statistically rare in the population as a whole is dramatically common within a family. If you have a specific rare gene, your close relatives are thousands of times more likely to have a replica of that same gene than a stranger chosen at random.
okay, let's get into the mechanics of sharing, starting with the bedrock, the 50% rule for close relatives. How do we explain the exact 50% probability for gene sharing between siblings or between a parent and child?
We need to picture the process of sex cell formation, or meiosis. Suppose you, the listener, contain one copy of a rare gene, G. You received it from one parent. Let's use the father for simplicity. Every one of your father's ordinary body cells contained one copy of G.
So when he produced a sperm,
When he produced a sperm, he doled out half of his genes to that sperm. It's a coin flip every single time. Half the time, the sperm gets gene G, half the time, it doesn't.
that's where the 50% comes from. Therefore, there is a 50% chance that the sperm that created your sibling received the gene G.
Right. And the same parallel reasoning applies if you received G from your mother. This means that if you had 100 siblings, roughly 50 of them would contain any particular rare gene that you contain. That is a powerful and reliable mechanism for a gene to increase its numbers.
And the same logic holds for the parent-child relationship. If you contain one copy of gene H, half your sex cells contain H, meaning the chance any one of your children has it is exactly 50%.
Yes. This constant figure allows us to define the index of relatedness, or probability that two individuals share a particular rare gene.
So full siblings and parent-child relationships have 1/12 $2. Identical twins who share 100% of their genes have $100.
It's crucial to note that the parent-child relationship is always exactly one half, barring new mutation. For siblings, it's an average figure, $400 too, since the precise number varies based on the pure luck of the meiotic draw during the formation of each egg and sperm.
Now, for anyone trying to calculate their relatedness to a distant cousin, the chapter offers a fantastic practical method, the climb up, climb down rule. This is where Hamilton truly formalized the math.
It's a beautifully simple algorithm for a complex reality. We start by identifying all the most recent common ancestors between the two individuals. Let's call them A and B. For first cousins, that means the shared grandparents. We ignore all ancestors farther back.
Step 1. We trace the genetic path. We count the generation distance, which we call datolers. We start at individual A, climb up the family tree until we hit a common ancestor, and then climb down again to individual B.
Let's use the uncle-aunt to nephew-niece relationship first, as it's a bit simpler. The generation distance is 3 threeses. Starting at the uncle A, you climb up one generation to the common ancestor.
The shared parent, their parent.
Right, the shared parent-grandparent. Then you descend 2 generations to the niece B. So 1 + 2 = 3.
1 + 2 = 3.
Okay.
Okay, step 2.
Calculate the relatedness contribution from that one ancestor. You multiply $12 by itself once for each step of the generation distance driller. If G already 3 the relatedness via that ancestor is 12 of $3, which is 18 $2.
Step 3. Sum the contributions from all common ancestors.
Exactly. So now let's tackle first cousins. The generation distance drawlers via each common ancestor, grandfather and grandmother, is 4. You go up 2 generations to the grandparent and down 2 generations to the cousin B. 2 + 2 = 4.
Okay, so that's 12 4 threes, which is $166.
Right, but you have 2 common ancestors, the grandfather and the grandmother.
I see.
Each ancestor contributes 116 sizes to the shared genetic probability. So we multiply the 166 odds by 2, which gives us $266, simplifying to $18.
So first cousins have $18. They're genetically equivalent to a great-grandchild, where the generation distance is 3, and the uncle-aunt to a nephew-niece relationship, as we established earlier, comes out to $14.
These precise calculations allow us to move from the vague notion of close relatives to a hard mathematical definition of the altruism threshold, the point at which self-sacrifice is genetically justified.
And the rule for a suicidal altruistic gene to be successful is elegant in its simplicity, isn't it?
It is. It must save a larger number of copies of itself than it loses.
Which translates into the minimum requirements for the survival machine sacrifice. To justify one's death, the individual must save.
More than two full siblings, children, or parents, since they have 12 and $2, or more than four half-siblings, uncles or aunts, with 4 tongue $2, or more than 8 first cousins, with 12 8 hours.
That makes the cost-benefit analysis feel visceral. It's a pure numbers game for the gene pool. You might sacrifice yourself for 3 siblings, but never for 3 first cousins.
Exactly. The death of the altruist, on average, tends to be perfectly compensated by the survival of enough copies of that exact same gene in the beneficiaries.
And this mathematical equivalence forces us to fundamentally reclassify parental care.
Yes. Hamilton's insight was stressing that parental care is genetically just a special case of kin altruism.
Because the relatedness between a parent and its own child is 1,202 deals, and the relatedness between that adult and its orphan baby brother is also true deal 12-2 deal. The genetic incentive is identical.
This is a critical point that the chapter stresses. A gene for big sister altruism should theoretically have just as good a chance of spreading as a gene for parental altruism, provided the conditions are equal.
So the difference in relationship, one gives genes, the other receives them, is irrelevant from the gene's perspective.
Totally relevant. Both are highly reliable conduits for gene replicas. This whole framework is called kin selection, and it demonstrates how altruism within the family is just a consequence of gene selection applied across all mathematically defined degrees of relationship.
We've established the genetics and the mathematical framework, but those neat symmetrical calculations of relatedness are based on elemental certainty-saving exact numbers of kin.
Right.
As we move into the real world, we realize that life is far messier. We need to introduce complex, real-world factors that modify the equation.
Right. If a survival machine is programmed to perform these calculations unconsciously, it can't just use dollars. It has to incorporate statistical risks of death, both for the altruist and the potential recipient, and crucially, their future value.
So the first major modification is incorporating actuarial weightings. This truly feels like we are applying life insurance policies to biology. Why is age or current health status so important?
Because the calculation must account for the ultimate goal, increasing the gene's frequency in the future. Therefore, every individual has an expectation of life, but more strictly, a reproduction expectancy.
Or even a general capacity to benefit own genes in the future expectancy.
That's a better way to put it. This is crucial. Saving an old relative, even a close one with 1 in 202 goal, has significantly less impact on the future gene pool than saving an equally close young relative who has the bulk of their life and massive reproductive capacity ahead of them.
So the calculation must heavily weigh age and potential fertility. Even if grandparents and grandchildren share the same relatedness, two $4 books, genes for grandparent to grandchild altruism have a higher selective advantage.
Yes, because the grandchild is a better bet for the future of the gene pool than the grandparent is. It's an investment strategy. It is entirely possible, for instance, for the net benefit of assisting a young, distant relative, like a first cousin with 1 of 5-2 who is still in their reproductive prime,
to exceed the net benefit of assisting an old, close relative, like a parent with $12 to-do who is post-reproductive and ailing.
Exactly. The individual organism is essentially programmed to act as a life insurance underwriter.
So they're risking assets, their own survival and time, based on 2 factors. 1, the relatedness, and 2, the recipient's good risk status, meaning their remaining life expectancy, versus the insurer's own.
This brings us back to the central condition for altruism to evolve in this complex actuarial world. The net risk to the altruist must be less than the net benefit to the recipient multiplied by the relatedness. But now, risks and benefits are calculated in this complex, age-weighted actuarial way.
This is the point where the famous Haldane anecdote comes in. JBS Haldane joked about having no time to calculate differential equations while pulling drowning people out of the water.
Right.
We need to remind ourselves constantly that animals aren't consciously performing sophisticated actuarial mathematics.
Absolutely not. And this is the great leap of understanding the chapter stresses. The complex behavior emerges just as a human can throw and catch a ball, behaving as if they had solved complex differential equations and predicting its trajectory. An animal is pre-programmed through generations of selection in such a way that it behaves as if it made a complicated weighted calculation.
A calculation involving Tadera's age, risk, and benefit. The subconscious level is running the functional equivalent of the math.
That's it.
But we, as researchers, need a way to visualize exactly what that unconscious calculation looks like. So this sets the stage perfectly for the next step, the computer model.
To clarify this as-if mechanism, the chapter guides us through a thought experiment involving a computer simulation of a survival machine making an altruistic decision. This provides a clear, logical structure for understanding precisely how costs and benefits are weighed in the currency of gene survival.
We are modeling a scenario where an animal faces several alternative behaviors, A, B, or C, and for each behavior, the computer calculates a net benefit score.
And the structuring is key. Benefits get a plus sign, risks or costs get a minus sign.
And critically, both benefits and risks are immediately weighted by being multiplied by the appropriate index of relatedness, $3.
Exactly. Since an individual's relatedness to itself is 100% of its own genes, risks and benefits to the self are given their full weight. They are not devalued at all. Self-interest is the baseline.
So the whole calculation looks like a long, weighted sum, potentially a massive equation. Net benefit, benefit to self, plus times benefit to brother, times risk to brother, plus 2 times benefit to cousin, 2 times risk to cousin insanity.
And so on, summing up the genetic gain from every individual affected by the action. The model animal then chooses the behavior pattern that emerges with the largest net benefit score.
And we should remember that largest doesn't mean positive.
No. If all possible actions result in a negative score, say all options involve risk, the animal still chooses the highest negative score, which is the least of the evils. If doing nothing yields the highest score, the model animal does nothing.
Let's walk through the detailed numerical thought experiment provided in the text, the mushroom example, because it perfectly illustrates how altruism can overcome pure selfishness, even when resources are scarce.
Okay. Imagine an animal that finds a clump of 8 mushrooms. Accounting for nutrition and minor risk, they are worth plus 6 units of survival value each. The animal is already full and can only eat 3 of them without getting sick.
And who's nearby? Who can hear its food call?
A brother with 12 years of dollars, a cousin with $12, and a stranger with $2.
Okay, first, the purely selfish action. Keep quiet and eat 3 mushrooms. The remaining 5 rot. The net benefit score is simple. 3 times 6 equals plus 18 units to the self.
Correct. Plus 18. Now the altruistic action, give the food call. The 8 mushrooms must now be shared equally between the 4 individuals who respond, meaning 2 mushrooms per person.
So the altruist only benefits by 2 times 6, which is 12 units for itself. That's a personal loss of 6 units compared to being selfish.
A personal loss, yes. But the altruist's genes get a payoff when the relatives eat their share because of shared replicas. Let's calculate the net benefit score for the altruistic action using the weighted sum.
Let's do it.
We apply the weighting. Benefit from self with R equal to 1 is 1 times 12, which is 12.
Yeah.
Benefit from the brother, R equals 1/2, is 1/2 times 12, which is 6.
6.
Benefit from the cousin, R equals 1/8, is 1/8 times 12, which is 1.5.
1.5.
And benefit from the stranger, R equals 0, is 0 times 12, which is 0.
Summing those contributions up, 12 plus 6 plus 1.5 plus 0 equals plus 19.5.
The conclusion is stark and clear. Plus 19.5 for altruism is greater than plus 18 for selfishness.
So in this specific scenario, even though the individual body suffered a personal loss of value 18 down to 12, altruism pays the selfish genes because the overall genetic wealth increases.
Exactly. So the moral of the story is, if you ever find a clump of mushrooms and your brother and cousin are around, your genes are literally forcing you to share, even if it means you get slightly less for yourself.
The critical realization is that the gene pool is not full of genes that are literally performing complex math.
No, absolutely not. Rather, the gene pool is filled with genes that influence bodies to behave as if they had made such calculations. These estimates of costs and benefits are based on past experience, or, more accurately, the statistical average conditions that characterized past gene survival.
As long as the environment is stable.
As long as environmental conditions remain stable, as long as the frequency of encountering kin hasn't changed, these program estimates are good ones. And survival machines tend to make the right decisions, on average, even unconsciously. This programming is the core of Genesmanship.
The computer model assumes that survival machines know exactly who their relatives are. But in the real world, certainty is a huge problem. Animals don't carry birth certificates.
No.
They must rely on estimates of relatedness, which are subject to error and uncertainty.
That's right. The relatedness we use in the equation can only be an average number. For instance, if 2 individuals in a species could equally well be half-brothers with 1/4-2 or full brothers with 2 1/4 of 2, the usable figure for the decision-making process is the average of those probabilities.
Which would be 3/8 or 0.375.
Exactly. The animal's internal unconscious estimate must align statistically with the average relatedness that characterized the environment in the past.
Since animals don't possess written records, names, or formal marriages like humans, though the text notes that even human tribal rituals and incest taboos testify to our high kinship consciousness, they must follow simple, practical behavioral rules or heuristics to identify kin.
Yes, proxies for relatedness.
What are some of these practical rules?
Well, one potential, though less reliable rule is based on physical resemblance, behaving altruistically toward individuals who look like you. While this might statistically help kin since you share some genes you probably look somewhat alike, the chapter suggests this rule is fragile.
And if that rule misfires, it could lead to irrational generalizations, right?
Yeah,
The text makes a connection that outside its original evolutionary context, this rule could be linked to phenomena like racial prejudice.
it does suggest that. It's presented as an irrational generalization of a simple, useful kinship rule applied to populations that are genetically quite similar anyway.
A more common and practical rule, especially in species that don't migrate or who stick to small, cohesive groups, is proximity group membership.
Yes. The rule is essentially, be nice to any member of the group you meet frequently. In species that live in stable groups, like schools of whales or baboon troops, the probability of encountering a random individual who is not a relative is so low that the generalized altruism is worth the cost.
This is used to explain the incredible altruistic behavior reported in schools of whales, where companions hold up injured or drowning members, or similar cooperation in troops of monkeys.
The assumption is that the overall probability of sharing genes within that cohesive group justifies the behavior. This leads us directly to the concept of misfirings of altruism.
When a perfectly good, reliable rule works well in the natural environment but fails spectacularly when applied to an unusual situation.
That's it.
Give us the classic misfiring example.
The dolphin rescuing a drowning human swimmer is perfect. The animal's hardwired, evolved role might be something simple like, save any long thing thrashing about and choking near the surface, a rule designed to save fellow distressed school members.
But it misfires on a human because humans were never part of the dolphin's evolutionary past.
Right. The gene for save drowning things spreads because it saves relatives 99% of the time, even though it wastes effort on a human 1% of the time.
We see this misfiring in parenting too, right? Like chicks giving food calls, those twitters, to attract others to food. In nature, all chicks in the nest are siblings, so the gene for twitter and share spreads.
Yes, but it misfires dramatically on a farm when a hen is made to sit on a clutch of unrelated eggs. Their behavior is shaped by past conditions where strangers were never found in the nest.
And adoption.
Similarly, the adoption of orphans in species like monkeys is usually considered a mistake in terms of genetic fitness. The generous female is wasting time and energy she could be investing in her own future kin. It's a mistake that happens too infrequently for natural selection to have selected against the fundamental maternal instinct completely.
The misfiring is often exploited by other species, leading to a genetic arms race. This is most vividly seen with brood parasites like the cuckoo.
Yes, the cuckoo. It exploits the host bird's simple rule. Be nice to any small bird sitting in the nest that you built. This works perfectly because historically the contents of that nest were guaranteed to be the host's own chicks.
But the cuckoo lays its egg in the nest, and the unwitting host bird raises the cuckoo, often to the detriment of its own genetic investment.
But the host birds fight back. They evolve to instinctively favor eggs with species-typical markings. The cuckoos retaliate with genetic mimicry-laying eggs that are more and more like the host species, a genetic lie designed to cheat the system.
And we see a similar pressure in guillemots.
Yes, guillemots. They nest on flat, crowded rock ledges where eggs roll and get mixed up. This forces them to discriminate and recognize their own eggs by speckling pattern. The chapter uses this example to definitively illustrate a fundamental evolutionary concept, the evolutionarily stable strategy, or ESS.
Let's pause on ESS. We've used that term, but what does it really mean in this context?
An ESS is a strategy, a set of behavior roles that, adopted by most members of a population, cannot be bettered by any alternative rival strategy. Once an ESS is established, selection will always work to keep it dominant. It's an evolutionary equilibrium that resists being cheated.
Now apply that stability principle to the guillemots. If they developed a communal babysitting circle where everyone sat on a random egg, Why would that system be inherently unstable?
Because it's open to cheating. A mutant individual, a cheater, would soon emerge who laid more eggs than average and refused to sit on any of them.
And since the altruists are non-discriminating,
They would still look after the cheater's eggs, the gene for cheating would rapidly spread, and the nice, friendly babysitting circle would break down. The only strategy that is stable, the ESS in this environment, is individual discrimination, recognizing and sitting exclusively on one's own egg.
this focus on certainty brings us to the most powerful form of asymmetry in all of Genesmanship. Why is parental altruism so much stronger and more common than sibling altruism, even though the genetic relatedness is mathematically the same?
Tor equals one half for both.
Right. It comes down to the asymmetry of certainty.
The gene for individual selfishness has the enormous, overwhelming advantage of certainty of individual identity. You, the survival machine, are 100% sure that you contain 100% of your genes. Any altruistic gene that directs resources toward others runs the immediate, undeniable risk of making mistakes of identity.
Either accidental or deliberately engineered by parasites.
Yes. Therefore, we must expect individual selfishness in nature to a greater extent than genetic relatedness alone would predict. Certainty trumps probability.
And this certainty difference extends across the family. Who is raising the young?
The mother is generally far more certain of her young. She lays the egg, she bears the child. The father is vulnerable to cuckoldry or deception. This is why, in many species, we predict and observe less paternal care than maternal care. The risk calculation for the father's genes is higher.
And we can take this further into the family tree. The book proposes an intriguing prediction. Maternal grandmothers should be more altruistic than paternal grandmothers.
The reasoning relies on the certainty chain. The maternal grandmother is absolutely sure of her daughter's children. The daughter is her own offspring, and she witnessed the birth. The paternal grandmother, however, relies on her son's certainty, which is vulnerable to deception.
Therefore, maternal grandmothers have a higher degree of certainty about the presence of their gene replicas.
It's a fascinating prediction. And similarly, maternal uncles should statistically be more altruistic than legal fathers in societies with known marital infidelity, as they are sure the child's mother is at least their half-sister.
Whereas the father cannot be 100% sure the child is his.
Finally, although parent-child relatedness is symmetrical through left-2 both ways, the asymmetrical factors of practical competence, the parent is older and better equipped to help, and crucially, life expectancy.
Children are younger and have a longer reproductive expectancy.
Right. All of this ensures that parental care, while genetically equivalent to sibling care, is the dominant, most frequently observed, and most reliable form of kin altruism we see in nature.
So to synthesize the essential insights from the chapter Genesmanship, it all comes back to this central idea.
Yes. The selfish gene concept successfully resolves the paradox of individual altruism by viewing it as an elegant result of gene-level selfishness. It establishes parental care as merely the most widespread, historically obvious, and most genetically certain example of kin selection in action.
It's crucial to grasp the historical context. Parental care has been recognized as evolutionary advantageous since Darwin. Hamilton's breakthrough was demonstrating the genetic equivalence of all close relationships, that 12-12-2 agelo is 12-12-2, regardless of the direction of the relationship.
And he naturally emphasized collateral kin siblings, cousins, social insects, precisely because the mechanisms of parental care were already well understood and therefore less exciting for research.
This clarity allows us to address the common but mistaken criticism that kin selection lacks examples in nature.
Critics often fail to realize that all parental structures, from milk-secreting glands and kangaroo pouches to the act of building a nest, are empirical proof of kin selection working. They are physical manifestations of genes investing in bodies likely to contain their copies.
So any generalized theory of natural selection that predicts parental altruism must also predict altruism between collateral kin.
It has to. The underlying genetic relatedness is equivalent. The differences we observe in behavior are almost entirely due to the practical challenges of identity, certainty, and age-weighted risk.
Indeed, we've seen that the genetic certainty of identity is paramount, driving the strength of individual selfishness versus altruism, particularly favoring maternal certainty.
So now consider this final provocative thought for you to explore, one that carries the logic of genesmanship forward. We noted that the mother is more certain than the father, and the maternal grandmother is more certain than the paternal grandmother. In species where fraternal altruism, say, sister-to-sister altruism, evolves so strongly that it overcomes the enormous advantage of individual self-certainty.
like in social insects, which we didn't discuss here.
Right. What unique genetic or biological factor must be at play to make sibling relatedness suddenly far more certain or genetically concentrated than parental relatedness? Think about that asymmetrical inheritance.
A fascinating riddle that pushes the boundaries of genesmanship even further, inviting us to look for genetic anomalies that might shift the entire balance of certainty and relatedness. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the precise mathematical and evolutionary origins of altruism.
We hope this provided you with the foundational clarity to appreciate how selfish genes, through careful unconscious programming and statistical calculation, compel bodies to be nice.